Hi there, I'm Jonathan Spring. I'll be talking about our paper Historical Analysis of Exploit Availability Timelines, joint work with Alan Householder, Jeff Chrabaszcz, Trent Novelli, and David Warren. This paper is at CSET, and the conference is August 2020. Very standard legal slide. The topic of our historical analysis is public exploit development. This is a part of the exploit development lifecycle, and it fits in sort of as you see here alongside private exploit development, but also the public aspect of vulnerability being published is the main driver of vulnerabilities getting remediated. Our main goal in general is to have defenders remediate vulnerabilities more and more often than they do now. So there are fewer adversary exploits that are going through and causing incidents. Our historical analysis focuses specifically on the public aspect of exploit development, and we don't focus on private exploit development. This obviously has some trade-offs. The benefits are that the data is transparently available. Sort of by definition, it's public, and so we have access to it. Obviously, what happens in public is not the entire system. So we are sort of defining a scope here that has some known limits, and the trade-off, though, is that we can sort of adequately and accurately measure that completely based on focusing on the public aspect. Our research questions to help us understand the exploit availability within the exploit development lifecycle are these three questions. The first two are more basic, right? So how many CVE-IDs get public exploit code within a year? Note that we're going to say CVE-IDs and not vulnerabilities in general. This is because CVE-IDs are the things that get tagged both in vulnerability disclosure documents as well as what we can then track an exploit to and link that together to figure out how much time elapsed. There are some vulnerabilities that don't get CVE-IDs, and that's okay because many or a lot of them do, or an important subset of vulnerabilities get CVE-IDs, but that is an explicit choice that we've made to make the data quality higher, but it's another sort of restriction of the scope of those. So to question number 2, of those CVE-IDs that get public exploit code, how quickly is it published? And do different subpopulations of these CVE-IDs, as MITRE defines in the common weakness enumeration, have different publication rates? And finally, and sort of the really core important research question is, are there features that we can identify of a CVE-ID that correlate with this exploit publication? So there are a couple of important parts of background. One is that we want to use exploit publication as part of prioritizing and triaging vulnerabilities in general. Our work on a stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization has sort of codified how we would want that information to be used, but there are certainly other people who are working on that. EPSS is related to using exploit timelines to prioritize vulnerabilities as well. And so it's important to get historical background in order to move forwards with these things. Of course, there's a long history of both practitioners and researchers, and these are just a sort of opportunistic selection of some important pieces of work, of course. The Dan Guido stuff is obviously stood the test of time pretty well, but also Luca has done a bunch of work on different aspects of this problem. And the thing is that although there's been a lot of work on this, none of them have really taken this sort of quite long historical view. We take 7 years of data, and we also take a sort of novel methodological approach by using survival analysis. So survival analysis has mostly been used in medicine for hazard analysis of which things, properties, comorbidities, whatever, impact the survival of a population. In this case, they mean literal survival. They're usually doing mortality rates. But we are going to consider that a CVE-ID survives as long as it has been published, so it's been born, but there's no public exploit code associated with it. We consider the publication date by definition is positive or zero, because publication of an exploit tagged with the CVE-ID is public disclosure, although it is not exactly the public disclosure that everyone might want. It certainly is a kind of public disclosure. So the statistical model, which is a Cox hazard, proportional hazard model, provides an interval estimate for how the different features affect the survival of the different CVE-IDs in the population. The total population is about 75,000 vulnerabilities over this 7-year span. The model assumes a proportional relationship for the effect of each variable, so there's no sort of logistic or exponential or additive relationships modeled with a Cox proportional hazard model. So we take this on as an assumption. It's probably fine, but an untested assumption. So one of the things that we want to look out for. Our data sources are, of course, the important way in which we're going to measure all of these different aspects of the exploit development lifecycle. There's really two important ones: the date of the publication of the CVE-ID, which we have these 4 sources here, and I should note that the CERT-CC data has a couple of different dates on it, actually. So it's actually 5 or 6 different dates there. So the minimum of those 5 or 6 dates is the publication date for the CVE-ID, and then we have 2 sources for exploit code publication, as long as it's associated with a CVE-ID. We use the GitHub repositories and rather than the web interfaces for exploitdb and Metasploit, because both the Metasploit and exploitdb GitHub repositories are clearly and consistently timestamped for exactly when the exploit code was committed, and also it contains comments and other sort of auxiliary information that often is where the contributors will put the CVE-ID. We rely on manual tags such as the committers, including these CVE-ID tags in the databases, because it is an outstanding hard and Turing complete problem to identify equivalent exploits where 2 exploits exploit exactly the same vulnerability. Of course, there are heuristics and fuzzing and all of these things used to help with that, but we so far find that the manual tags are better quality and much more efficient, of course, because it's just text matching. And so we rely on that. And so, of course, there are going to be some pieces of exploit code in these repositories that are improperly labeled and we will miss. So we should consider that to be undercounted slightly. This chart is the clearest and most straightforward presentation of our results. Do note that the y-axis is clipped down to 0.95, so there's quite a lot below here that does survive, that is, does not have public exploit code associated with it. But mostly note that exploits happen quite quickly when they happen at first, and then they slow down, but they do continue to get published as the year goes on, ending up with us at about 4% total, of CVE-IDs with publicly associated exploit code. So a little bit more concretely here, 4.1% of those CVE-IDs don't survive. They see public exploit code associated with them. Just to be a bit concrete, that's about 3,100 CVE-IDs over 7 years. Now, of those 3,100, 42% of them see their exploit code published on the same day as disclosure. This is not exactly a 0-day exploit or 0-day vulnerability, because when we say 0-day, normally we mean that the adversary is exploiting the vulnerability actively in the wild, not just that the exploit is public. And these two things are not exactly the same. But of course, it is still not desirable for the exploit code to be public being the first time that people hear about the vulnerability. As you can see, the code is published quite quickly, but there's also a long tail, as with everything on the internet. So, although about half of all exploit code is published within 2 days, if it's going to appear, you can never quite be safe because there's still more exploit code getting added as time goes on. This data, because it's curated just since 2013, sort of starts when these exploit databases were already mature. And so these data points don't include sort of big jumps of people post hoc labeling exploits for CVEs that existed before the exploit databases. So this is pretty reliable as far as that goes. Also, as you might expect, different CWEs for easy or hard to exploit types of vulnerability do have a significant and sometimes quite large effect on exploit publication. You can get sort of a visual sense of that here. So 2 things. You can see that the different CWEs have different exploit publication rates based on the sort of middle teal baseline, right? Those are going to differ. The use after free happens slightly more often than buffer overflows. You see the CSERFs, as sort of mentioned in the last slide, happen much more often, right? Especially like quite quickly there. Left middle, there's a big drop. But also, and this is getting into our third research question, if you partition the data based on date, vulnerabilities that are published more recently are more likely to have public exploit code associated with them than vulnerabilities that were published 7 years ago. This trend varies slightly in its impact across different CWEs, but it's remarkably consistent across the different CWE types. And in fact, it's consistent across the whole data set. So one thing that we see with this is that as we move forwards in time, it's more likely that public exploit code will be associated with a CVE-ID. There are several factors that are associated with CVE-IDs in some way or another. The base CVSS base score is lightly correlated, but is positively correlated in a meaningful way. The number of CVE-IDs and the publication date both influence this positively about the same amount or slightly more as CVSS base scores. Certain vendors are more likely to have exploits than others, but this is also not super surprising. If a vendor predominantly makes security software, their code is more likely to see public exploits than writers of non-security software, things like this. Our overall interpretation here is a couple of good things and a couple of bad things. On the one hand, only about 4% of CVE-IDs have exploit code published. That seems all right. That's not very many. On the other hand, it is published quickly when it is published, half of the time within 2 days. So so we have a second good one here, right? We have demonstrated sort of an exploit search of these different databases, and we think that we can integrate that into prioritization in a somewhat automated way because we have the CVE-ID tags, we have all of this stuff. But on the other side, the need to do this is also increasing because we see the exploit code publication speed increasing over time. Now, one consistent interpretation, although there's no causal information in what we have, is that there's perhaps a latent variable here, and these various things that we've tested for are proxying for that latent variable. And one hypothesis is that latent product is the value of the vulnerable component to the attackers. This is an important thing for future work to try to study. I've been discussing a lot of these limitations as we've been going along, but to pull them all together here, I think is valuable. You can see a longer discussion of these in the paper. This restricts our interpretation and to some extent like informs future work, which is all important. But I think that the results themselves are pretty clear. So we have a few ideas for future work. Of course, there's lots of other things that one could do. And we are open to anyone else who's got more and better ideas, because we certainly don't have all of them. So if you do, thank you very much for your time. I hope you found the presentation useful. If you have any questions, do feel free to reach out. Also, if you would like to have a look at the code we used, you can go to our GitHub and find it at this project.